Yo, what's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Terminator Training Show. Hope everyone had an awesome Thanksgiving. Today's episode is going to be a Q&A. I feel like I haven't posted a Q&A in a while, although my last episode was a Q&A. I think I had recorded that well before it went up. So looking forward to getting into some solid Q&As this week and getting back to you guys on as many as I can. I didn't get to as many on Instagram as I usually do, just because I usually I post my Q&As on days where I don't think I'm going to be all that busy. And then yesterday, sure enough, pretty much right after I posted my Ask Me Anything, shit hit the fan and I became busy. Nothing crazy, just had to take care of some things and I didn't really have time to get back to many questions, but I will try and get to some of the questions that I didn't get to on Instagram here on the show, as well as maybe some repeat ones. But I actually got some really good questions this week, so I'm looking forward to that. For whatever reason, I am looking at myself in the video reflection and it looks like I have some sort of stain on my mustache, but I think that is just the lighting. Either way, we're going to get into these questions. So let's hop into the first one. My SFRE 5-mile time trial will be on a continuous uphill loop with one major downhill. I live in rolling hills. How do I prepare for this with TTM 2 and 5 mile tempo runs on treadmill incline? Yes, I would definitely do that. You don't have to do that for every single one, but you probably want to, if you live in rolling hills and you just don't have the ability to continuously go uphill for an extended period of time, I would absolutely do some of your tempo runs on inclines. You also could consider doing a little bit more frequent hill sprints. So there are hill repeats in the program. There's hill repeats every few weeks in place of flat repeats, but maybe you could do, 2 parts flat repeats, 1 part hill repeats instead of doing them. Maybe just add 1 per phase instead of just doing the one that is in there per phase. I believe there's 1 per phase. So just getting used to running on inclines will be a huge thing for you. You can do most of them in your rolling hills because you also want to get used to running downhill, especially if there's one major downhill that can be very stressful on the joints. So if you're only doing uphill stuff or if you're only doing things on flat and you never really expose yourself to downhill running, then that'll be a shock to you on the SFRE day. Not that it's a huge deal because SFREs are short, so you're not going to be doing it day after day after day. So, going all out one time on a downhill, if you're not used to it, you're probably going to be a little banged up after, but it's not going to be the end of the world. But yeah, using some sort of treadmill incline, you don't necessarily have to run the entire thing on an incline. But, if you're doing repeats or cruise intervals or something like that, maybe do 50 to 66% on an incline and do the rest on flats. And obviously you're going to have to slow your pace down too. So it's going to make things a little bit more complicated with pacing. But if you stick to mostly effort rather than hitting this perfect pace, as is emphasized in the program, then you are going to be a lot better off. So I would definitely get used to that. It's like anything, you got to get adapted to the conditions that you're going to be running in, and this would be a good option. Next question. As a former 18 Delta, do you stay on top of medical training? No, absolutely not. I don't really have much interest in staying on top of the latest and greatest medical stuff. I've never really been a super medical nerd. Even when I was a Delta, I definitely was more into the trauma aspect of it than like reading medical textbooks and things like that, which is not the case for everyone. Some 18 Deltas are massive medical nerds. A lot of them go on to do something in the medical field, whether they're PAs or even doctors, surgeons, whatever it is. But I just didn't really have that kind of passion for it. I was a lot more into fitness, as you can probably guess by the fact that I am now a fitness coach and do a lot of fitness content. So I definitely feel very, very confident that I could save somebody's life a lot better than most people out there. But you won't find me hanging out on my own time and listening to medical podcasts or reading medical textbooks because I'm just not super interested in it. Next question. What is a good way to implement running after being sick for 8+ days? Great question. This actually happened to me pretty much exactly. I took 8 days off from all training last month. And the first few runs back were brutal. The first few lifts back, I felt pretty good, even though I lost 8 or 9 pounds over that time. Just had no appetite whatsoever. Obviously, most of that's going to be water weight, not actual tissue. But either way, I came back and I was kind of surprised by my lifting performance and my lifting motivation and whatnot, and the lack of strength that I lost. But I transiently lost a significant amount of running endurance, especially faster stuff. I could go for When I reintroduced it, I could go for a longer period of time, but at a very, very slow, easy pace. And my heart rate was a little higher, even at those slower paces than it usually is. But anytime I started to go any faster, I just felt terrible. The breathing was way off and it was really rough. So when you come back, you definitely want to start easy. When you start reintroducing fast, I don't know where you're at in your running plan or if you're doing speed work or anything like that. But if you are, I would not launch back into like day one, week one of whatever program or whatever plan you were running before. You'll want to ease back into it with some easy runs, and easy, not long runs, like 30 minutes, 25 minutes, whatever it may be, like nice and short, very, very easy. Don't worry about your pace. Just stay in that nice, easy zone 2. And then as you start feeling a little more comfortable, maybe a couple runs in, you can start doing either some pickups to a tempo pace or something along those lines, or you could do some post-run strides for maybe a week and a half, sometimes 2 weeks. It really just depends on the person, depends on what you were sick with. If you had one of those COVID things that is going to potentially last a long time, which it seems like I had, I was still feeling the remnants of mine for another couple weeks after. And I don't think I did a true speed workout for almost 3 weeks. Luckily, because I eased back into it, which I highly recommend easing back into it, doing the things I just mentioned. When I first did my next tempo run after being sick for a while and after not doing tempo for almost 3 weeks, my pace wasn't all that bad and the experience wasn't all that bad. But when I started to reintroduce pickups as well as strides, I was just like, oh my God, that is really rough. And I don't feel very good if I were to try and do this for a long period of time, tempo or longer repeats or something along those lines. It would have been absolutely brutal and highly stressful and a lot to recover from. And you run the risk of potentially digging yourself into a deeper recovery hole if you come back too hot. Or even in some cases, if you come back a little bit too early, maybe you feel mostly better, but you're not 100% back to normal, back to full strength. You can potentially prolong how long it takes you to get back to full strength, or you can even make yourself sick again. Some people do that. So definitely ease back into it, even though it's going to feel like you lost some running ability when you first start. It is transient if you're smart about it and if you're patient and you don't just throw the kitchen sink at yourself when you come back and try to make up for that lost time. Just go nice and easy and be reasonable with it and just kind of listen to your body, and you should be back to full strength in no time. Next question, would you still utilize an intra-workout supplement even while on a cut? Yes, absolutely. If you're performance-based, so if your goal is to cut but also perform well, doing this on a cut is even more important than doing it in a calorie surplus or doing it at maintenance. You want to be as anabolic as possible around your training. And even if you are in an overall calorie deficit around training, you want to think like, I want to be in a surplus for this really short period of time, this peri-workout window. And then the rest of the day I can live in a deficit and just kind of create my deficit on my non-training days or on my easier training days or away from training. So what does that mean? Say you're eating 2,500 calories a day. If you eat 1,000 of those or 1,250 of those pre, intra, post workout, you are going to be a lot better off. You're going to perform a lot better, and it's not going to make any difference in your actual body composition changes, but you're just going to feel better in training. You're going to have better workouts and you're probably going to get better results. So when you're in a deficit, you absolutely want to really, really prioritize your peri-workout window. When you're in a surplus, it doesn't matter all that much. The reason I do it when I'm in a surplus or when I'm at maintenance is just because it's easy to get another 50, 60, 70 grams of carbs in just by sipping on it in a training session. And if you ever struggle with appetite, like getting enough food in, kind of sneaking those carbs in the back door intra-workout is a great thing. And also it's going to potentially improve your recovery and performance slightly, just depending on what you're doing for training. So I absolutely would really, really prioritize peri-workout nutrition, especially when you're in a deficit. That is if your goal is to perform. But honestly, even if you are only after physique changes, you still want to consider doing this, just because unless you are more of a novice and you don't really train that hard, regardless whether you have intra-workout fuel or not, it's absolutely going to make a difference. So I would definitely say yes, prioritize intra-workout shakes or intra-workout carbohydrates when you're in a cut. Next question, zone 2 for soft prep, fewer but longer sessions or more often but shorter sessions? Fewer but longer. Zone 2, the best adaptations you can possibly make in zone 2 occur as a result of duration. So you are much better off doing, for example, 2 90-minute sessions per week than you are doing 6 45-minute sessions or 6 30-minute sessions or whatever that math kind of ends up being. Of course, there's a skill component to whatever you're doing. So if you're running, the more frequently you run, the better you're going to get at it. Whereas if you only run once or twice a week, you're not going to get as good at it. But once you've kind of built that skill, and especially if you're training for soft, you're going to do a bunch of other things besides running. Longer sessions are just going to give you those better aerobic adaptations. Of course, you're much better off doing shorter sessions more frequently if that's all you can do. But 1-to-1, usually the longer you spend at that same effort, intensity, heart rate, whatever you want to use for your metric, the better you're going to actually adapt to it. And also you're going to spend long periods of time at selection around zone 2. Might be a little bit under zone 2 when you're doing land nav and all that kind of stuff, but you want to get your body, your joints, your connective tissue, your structure used to long, continuous, arduous bouts of that conditioning. So if you had to choose one or the other, I would choose long, but less frequent. Next question, at what temperature do you consider wearing warming layers for running outdoors? This depends on the person. It also depends on the overall conditions. So like, for example, if it's cold out, but also humid, which is very common here in North Carolina, humidity makes it feel colder than it actually is, which is kind of weird. You know, obviously when it's hot out, humidity makes it feel warmer, but actually when it's cooler, humidity makes it feel cooler. So I usually start considering layers. It depends. I'll use man tights and maybe one long sleeve shirt with a short sleeve over it. So I guess you can consider that layers. And I'll wear gloves if it's under 35 or so. Yesterday, I went on a tempo run and it was like 43, but I didn't realize how windy it was. So I went out and did my warm up. I was in shorts and a t-shirt, no gloves, nothing. And I was pretty damn cold until I started actually booking it on my tempo pace. So, and it was in the low 40s, but it was very, very windy. And I didn't choose my route very well. So the first solid 2/3 of my route was into the wind or into at least a side wind. And it was pretty rough. It slowed me down more than it actually made me cold, but my hands were very, very cold. And that's the thing. Everyone's a little different with their limbs. For me, my hands get really cold when it's cold out. And when I'm, you know, my core temperature is super high and I'm running hard, my hands are still freezing. So sometimes even if it's in the low 40s, I'll wear some gloves. If I went for an easy run yesterday in that temperature, I probably still would have gone out with just a t-shirt on, but I would have worn gloves and I probably would have turned around and came back and put like a long sleeve layer on. I was totally fine with shorts, but everyone's a little different. You want to err on the side of being cold or cool during your warm up, especially if you're going for like a performance-based run. So if you're doing some sort of time trial or if you're doing some sort of tempo work, really easy. If you're doing repeats, you can just kind of delayer as you go. But if you're warm and snug on your warm-ups, then you're probably going to be hot and no longer snug on your actual runs. So you want to err on the side of starting cold and then kind of allowing your body heat to warm you up. But if you know you're someone with very cold extremities, or if your ears get cold or something along those lines, you want to consider wearing gloves. You want to consider wearing some sort of headband around your ears or even a hat. Wearing a hat is a little bit kind of nuanced because your head gives off a lot of heat. And if you are wearing a hat that's kind of trapping all that heat in, it can make you overheat a little bit as the run progresses or the ruck progresses or whatever. But I would say anything under 40, you want to start considering wearing some more clothes. If it is, or maybe in the low 40s, it just depends on the person. So if it's getting down in the 20s, the teens, below that, then you probably want to start considering actual layers. One thing I will definitely recommend is the wool sock technique. When I go out and it's cooler than 30, maybe 25-ish, I usually just wear man tights. And when I say man tights, I just mean like compression pants. I wear 2XU compression pants, or I'll wear some sort of other like tight fitting tights, but I don't wear shorts over them. That's just personal preference. You could wear shorts over them, but it may not help for this. But when you are wearing those, your man parts are still exposed to a decently significant degree to the elements. And you don't get a ton of blood flow down there when you're actually running hard. Your blood flow is obviously going to your extremities and your core, kind of not really prioritizing that area. So what I do is usually stuff a wool sock down there and just kind of keep that area nice and warm, because if you've ever had a frozen genital area after a run or some sort of outdoor activity where you're just exposing that part of your body to wind and cold weather, it's not fun at all. So I would recommend doing that technique if it gets pretty damn cold. I haven't done that. I haven't thus far in North Carolina. I haven't gone on a run that was that cold that I needed one, but it's definitely something to remember as you go. Another thing that my wife makes fun of me for, but I really like doing, is sometimes it's really cold and I would prefer to have the ability to like wipe my snot and also keep my hands warm. So I'll wear wool socks on my hands instead of gloves. I learned this from my dad. My dad used to he didn't wear gloves when he ran. I grew up in Maine. So the winters were really, really cold and he wouldn't wear gloves. He would just wear socks, like wool socks on his hands. You're obviously a little bit less dexterity, but you don't really need dexterity when you're running. And you can also just wipe that shit off and you're not kind of getting this one pair of glove super sweaty and nasty. You can just throw your gloves, I guess, in the wash when you're done if they're gross, but I just found it easier to use wool socks on some runs. If it's not that cold, then I'll just wear some gloves that are a little bit thinner, but wool socks on your hands as well as in your crotch. Very, very underrated technique. Next question, do you recommend taking caffeine and creatine building up for selection? Creatine, yes. You can absolutely take creatine till the day you leave. A lot of people are worried about like this massive drop off in performance when they go off creatine or creatine withdrawals. I've even had questions about that in the past, and it's not enough that you're actually going to feel it. Additionally, it takes 3-4 weeks for creatine to completely leave your system, just like it takes a long time to build up in your system. Like you're not going to feel the effects of creatine the first day or the first week you start taking it. You don't start feeling it for a few weeks because it takes a while to saturate. It also takes that amount of time approximately to desaturate. And by the end of selection, you're not going to notice, you're going to feel like shit anyway. You're not going to notice that it's from creatine. And also, even if you stop taking creatine, you're also not going to feel like shit. You might feel a little bit less powerful in the gym. Your ATP, PC, energy system may be slightly, like almost immeasurably less. You might lose a little bit of water weight, but it's not going to be something that you feel all that much. Caffeine, a little different. You absolutely can use caffeine to prepare, but I would absolutely consider tapering it and cutting it out about 2 weeks before you go. That way you're not going through caffeine withdrawals first week of selection. You want to be reasonable with it. The best 2 ways to use caffeine are the following. One, you only use it a couple times per week around your most important intense training sessions. So say you have like 3 big sessions per week that you really want to focus on, you want to get your top performances on, maybe use caffeine for those sessions and then don't use it at all. I'm not saying like use pre-workout for those sessions and then drink coffee every day. I'm saying just don't use it at all on the other days. You'll actually feel it. You won't have to go on and off because you're not taking it frequently enough to like really build up a big tolerance to it. Another option is to use it for a couple months at a time and then take 2 to 3 weeks off, and then a couple months at a time, 2 to 3 weeks off. Every time you reintroduce it, you're going to have built that sensitivity to it again by taking time off. It takes about 12 days or so, give or take, to fully resensitize yourself to caffeine. So every time you get back on it, you're going to feel the effects of it and you're going to actually notice a lot of performance benefits. Now, even if you are reliant on caffeine, use caffeine, say, every day. Like I drink coffee every day, so I don't really feel it. Even if you are like that, there are still performance benefits, whether you're lifting or running. Running, you definitely, or any sort of cardio, you want to keep the caffeine low, but more of a steady intake. So for example, if you're going to lift, having like a 200 milligram or 250 milligram bolus of caffeine, like a pre-workout or something along those lines before your lift is usually going to be totally fine. If you're going to run and you have that much caffeine beforehand, some people might be all right, but a lot of people, that's going to affect their heart rate and therefore their RPE, their breathing and things like that. And that's not necessarily what you want. You'd be much better off splitting that into like 3 doses. So having like 75 milligrams before, 75 milligrams at the halfway point, maybe 75 milligrams towards the end or something along those lines, maybe even less for some people. It just depends on your sensitivity to it and how often you have it and, you know, whether caffeine really affects you all that much or not. But you can still, even if you don't feel it because you take it all the time, you can still receive performance benefits. That being said, although I have talked about this recently, I'll go over it briefly. The coffee packets that you find in the MREs at selection are not enough to support a daily caffeine habit where you're drinking a couple cups of coffee or a couple energy drinks or something along those lines. But they are enough to support performance if you taper and resensitize yourself to that caffeine. So for example, you go off it for 2 weeks, You get to gate week, maybe it's day 2 of gate week, you're feeling a little beat up from the day before, you're about to do a ruck. You have a coffee packet before you step off, and then maybe another coffee packet about what you think might be halfway through, or 2 coffee packets throughout, or whatever. So that is a good option, but you won't feel those, or you won't benefit from those, and you'll probably not even be able to keep your withdrawals at bay if you don't actually go off beforehand. So you can absolutely use both of these things. Creatine, use it right up till when you go if you want. It's not going to be some crazy game changer that's going to make you get selected versus not get selected if you don't use creatine, but it absolutely can be beneficial. Caffeine, can absolutely use it sparingly, use it strategically if you want the best results from it, but also make sure that you taper it before you go. Next question, push-pull leg split versus full body, which is better? Yes, it depends. The push-pull legs 6 days a week that most people do is not ideal. Even if your only goal is to get jacked, I still don't think that training 6 days per week in the gym is necessary, nor is it optimal. You can make it work for sure, but it's not optimal. It's just a lot of training, not enough recovery, and you're better off probably hitting like push-pull legs, rest day, upper lower, rest day, 5 days a week, or something along those lines. Or you could do push-pull legs. Say you do, 1 week you do push Monday, pull Wednesday, legs Friday, and then hit your next push day Saturday, and then kind of just do it asynchronously like that. So you have like an A week, B week, C week, and it resets. So every week you're doing one of those days twice, but it rotates each week. It's easier to see that if you write it out on paper, but that would be a lot more reasonable too. Or you could do it asynchronously. If you don't match your training up to the days of the week, say you have like a 9-day split or a 10-day split or something like that, you can take more rest days and you're going to get better results from that. Additionally, if you do push-pull legs, I don't like that sequence either. I like legs push-pull, or I like pull-push legs. The reason being, by the time you get to your leg day, if you do legs third and you do it after pull, you potentially are going to be fatiguing your lower back on that pull day. And also, by the time you get to your third lifting day, unless you're taking days off in between, of course, you're going to be fatigued from your other training going into the most fatiguing day to train, which is legs. So I would much rather do legs push-pull. That would be my top way to do it. But if you take more strategic rest days, I would say push or pull, push legs rather than push-pull legs. Full body is also great. It just depends on what you're kind of going for. So you could do full body 3 days per week. You could do it for 4 days per week. You could do like upper, lower, full, something along those lines. You could do some sort of push-pull legs full body combo that is kind of getting into the weeds, and you'd need some programming skill for that. But those are all options. Usually full body is going to be most appropriate for most people, most lifters, even though a lot of people don't want to hear that. Unless you're highly advanced, full body is probably the way to go. Also, if you don't want to be super sore, so like you want to do a decent amount of running or other conditioning, full body can be great because you just don't get sore. When you do it properly, you don't get nearly as sore because you're only hitting a movement pattern per muscle group per session, give or take. So full body can be a great thing to do for that. Or if you have a schedule that is not conducive to being super consistent, like you tend to miss days, whether you miss days because you lose motivation or whatever, which, is a whole different issue. But if you know yourself and you do that, if you're hitting full body, you're not missing a full day. Whereas if you're hitting push-pull legs and you don't really like leg day and you tend to skip it, you're missing leg day. But if you hit 2 full body days before that, then you've hit every muscle group. So if you skip a day, you're not leaving a lot of gains for certain areas of your body on the table. So it can be great for that. I personally like to switch back and forth every so often between these splits. Right now, I'm on a full body split. I have certain days where I hit more of a balanced full body. I have certain days where I hit more of an upper bias full body. I have certain days where I hit more of a lower bias full body. So honestly, if you're a beginner or if you are even intermediate, usually full body is the best way to go, but you can switch over to upper lower as you kind of get more advanced, as you find that you're getting stronger and it's taking longer to get through these full body sessions just because you have to warm up for each individual lift because you're hitting it likely a different body part for each lift. So it can take a while, or it can be really fatiguing. If you're super duper strong, there's a reason that most powerlifters, most bodybuilders who are really strong don't really train full body. And most of that is because A, they don't enjoy it, but B, it's going to take them forever to get through a training session because of all the warm-ups they'd have to do for each individual lift. And it just doesn't really fit that type of person quite as much. So Overall, either of these are great. Just don't do that six day a week push pull legs, especially if you're also doing conditioning. But in general, I would recommend similar to my 19-week hypertrophy program, which is push pull legs, upper lower, or some weeks it's upper lower push pull legs with 2 rest days per week. So that would be the way I attack it, and it really just depends on your goal. Next question, are Clif bars a good intra-ruck fuel source? Why or why not? No, they would not be the best. Clif bars have anywhere from like 4 to 7 grams of fiber in them and probably around the same amount of fat, which is not a ton. And that's not a bad thing in general. But when you are actually performing, when you're out there doing a ruck, this is assuming that you're trying to ruck fast, not necessarily, if you're doing a super long ass hike and it's hours and hours and hours and hours on end, then Clif bars are totally fine because you're not in that super high stressed out scenario where it's very difficult for your body to digest things and actually put the food you're eating into your bloodstream so it can actually perform its duties. But if you are doing something like a 12-mile ruck time trial, 8-mile ruck time trial, something along those lines, or if you're just doing some sort of training session that involves ruck running, you're going to be in zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, etc., and you're doing it for less than, I would say, 3.5 hours, then you're just going to want to stick to very, very quick, fast digesting carbohydrates because the fiber and the fat in Clif bars or anything else that has fiber and fat will slow digestion down and most likely become a GI nightmare. You might feel a lot of nausea. You might feel bloat. You might burp a lot. It might just sit in your stomach, cause cramps, side stitches, etc. You want very fast digesting types of carbohydrates when you are doing any sort of hard ruck or run. So Clif bars would not be a great option for that. And while we're on this question, there are a couple other questions that I got about how to fuel rucks. So I'm going to tie those into this question. So like I said, fast digesting carbohydrates, basically no other macros in them. And this is, of course, again, if you're going slower, not super duper long hours and hours. So you want usually a combination between liquid and solid or goos or gels or something along those lines. For most people, you want to probably start out around 50 grams of carbs per hour, maybe 60, depending on your size. You want to kind of start low because even though you could, and you hopefully will eventually be able to consume more carbs per hour, you want to start low so you can slowly titrate that dose up. What you don't want is to start too high with 80, 90, 100 grams of carbohydrates per hour if you're not used to it, and then run into GI issues or digestive issues. The goal should be to get as many grams of carbs per hour as possible without any sort of GI issues. And this just takes practice. It takes, like anything, your body adapts to it over time. There are Tour de France cyclists that can take in 130, 140 grams of carbohydrates per hour, but they didn't start there. They probably started at 40, 50, 60, and then worked their way up to find a good solid spot where they can take in as many grams as they can without having to run to the bathroom or puke or just be bloated and gassy. So it's a little bit of trial and error, and the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. But I would start with something like maybe 20 to 30 grams of carbs from a liquid source, whether that's Tailwind or Gatorade, a little bit of watered down Gatorade. You can also, the good thing about Tailwind and Gatorade, they have electrolytes as well. Usually I would recommend adding a little bit more salt to the Gatorade just because the sodium content is a little bit low, especially if it's warmer out or if you sweat a lot or if you know you're a salty sweater. Generally speaking, I would add 300 to 400, maybe 500 milligrams of sodium to it in any sort of salt form just to get that sodium up. Tailwind's pretty good with electrolytes, maybe a little bit of salt, but it really just depends on the person. But the problem with only relying on the liquid carbs is to get enough carbs per hour, you're also going to have to drink a ton of that actual fluid. And drinking too much fluid on a ruck or on a run is also not a good thing. It's going to, A, probably cause some GI issues, but B, it's going to overhydrate you. Your body can only take in so much water and fluid per hour when you're training. And a lot of people will think better take in more water because hydration. And when you do that and you go way overboard, if you're taking in 30, 32 plus ounces of water per hour, you think you're doing something good. But in reality, what you're doing is just making it so a lot of the symptoms of overhydration and the results of it, like the performance results of it, are similar to the performance results and the symptoms of dehydration. So you don't want to be too hydrated. So you probably should go back and forth between liquid and solid. So you can get another 30-ish grams of carbs per hour from a goo packet. Usually those are 25 to 30 grams of carbs or you could use the little gels, the gummies. Clif blocks are great, things along those lines. Or if you want to go the cheap route, you can go buy some Sour Patch or some Sour Skittles, whatever your candy, gas station candy of choice is, and use that. Of course, you want to keep it just candy. So, chocolate bars and things like that, probably fine, especially if you're going longer, like the Clif Bar example. But if you're eating a Snickers every 30 minutes, there's enough fat in there that it's going to slow digestion down. And that's not necessarily what you want, especially if you're going hard. So you want to keep it to like things like I just mentioned, the Sour Patch, the Swedish Fish, etc. Pure sugar, basically. So back and forth between those two, experiment with different things that you enjoy, that make you feel good, that you can afford. Some of the goos and gels are super expensive and you don't need to buy like these super highly formulated things. Like I said, you could literally just use gas station candy. And unless you're an elite athlete or something along those lines, it's not going to make a difference. So that would be how I prepare it. Just to reiterate the numbers. Make sure it's low fat, low fiber, no fat, no fiber. 16-ish to 24-ish ounces of water, maybe a little bit more if you're a massive individual and you're rucking and it's hot out and you can handle that much water. You've kind of worked your way up to it. But 16 to 24 is usually a good spot, regardless of the weather, regardless of the humidity. You're going to be totally fine in there. A lot of people think if it's hotter and more humid, they need to go way, way more in the water. It's really not that much. It's maybe a few ounces per hour, so long as you're hydrated going into these things and well fed. So let's start that again. Low fat, low fiber, very fast digesting sugar, 50 to 60, work your way up grams of carbs per hour, 16 to 24 ounces of fluid, anywhere between 500 and 1,000 milligrams of sodium per hour. You can absolutely use just regular salt if you want. You can use some sort of pre-formulated electrolyte beverage. You can titrate the sodium dose based on what you're drinking as far as electrolytes are concerned, based on your sweat rate, based on your sweat saltiness. You can actually buy for pretty cheap sweat testers that actually test how salty your sweat is. But a good rudimentary way to determine that is just to kind of look at your hat or your shirt or whatever, if it's really salty, or, if your eyes sting when you sweat. Mine sting like crazy. So I'm like a very, very salty sweater, but I've also done sweat tests as well. It's this little patch you put on your skin. It'll tell you approximately how much sodium per hour. And I believe they tell you the full hydration formulation for sodium plus water plus other electrolytes per hour. And that's what you really want to focus on. A lot of people make the mistake of going for like body armor or coconut water or something along those lines. Those are totally fine to drink when you're not training, but they're very high in potassium and low in sodium. And you lose a lot more sodium in your sweat than potassium. So you want a high sodium drink. Even only sodium would be totally fine during your training. And then potassium you can get from food elsewhere, because it's still very important. You just don't lose as much of it in sweat. So you can get that potassium elsewhere from other beverages and other foods throughout the rest of the day. And then also you could consider some salt tabs. If you need more salt and say you're drinking an electrolyte drink and it's not high enough in sodium, but you don't add sodium to it, you can also do salt tabs every so often. And that will help as well, especially if it's really, really hot out. So hopefully that gives you a good idea as to why Clif Bars are not great and what to do instead. Next question. In your opinion, what is the best room temperature for optimal sleep? I personally in the summertime, I put my thermostat, my air conditioning on 65. In the wintertime, I put my heat on 64. So like once it gets to 64, the heat will kick on just so it's not freezing in the house. But also I have a mattress topper, an 8-sleep mattress topper that keeps my mattress at whatever temperature I prefer. I run hot at night, especially at the beginning of the night when I fall asleep. The great thing about the 8-sleep, not affiliated with them, I wish I was, but maybe someday, is that it starts colder, and as your body temperature naturally cools off throughout the night. So usually in a healthy individual, you are going to be hotter when you first go to sleep, but you want your body temperature to cool off so you can fall into a nice deep sleep. But later in the night, you're actually going to be cold, most likely. Sometimes if you don't have your room climate controlled, or if you don't have a mattress topper or anything like that, which you don't need to get, it just objectively helps my sleep significantly. But if you don't, some people might wake up hot, but oftentimes with a mattress topper that starts cool, you want it to warm up a little bit, because otherwise you're going to wake up at 2, 3 a.m. freezing. And so the 8-sleep it uses AI to actually warm up throughout the night as my body temperature cools off and wants to warm up. Ideally in the morning when you wake up, the mattress is nice and warm, and that will help you stay asleep throughout the night. But that's my opinion. So let's go to the science. What does the science say? Somewhere in between 63 and 68, I believe. So I'm like right smack dab in the middle. If you are going to bed and it's 72, 74, 75, you are selling yourself short on sleep. And I understand that the electricity bill, the heating and cooling bill, especially in the summertime, if you live in hot weather, is going to be a little bit rough to look at. But I would rather pay a little bit of extra money every month to keep my house cool than just get shitty sleep and feel terrible and not recover and just be performing at not my max capacity every single day of the summer because I wanted to save some money on my heat bill. That's just me though. Everyone's a little different. If you would prefer to sell yourself short on sleep and save $5 to $10 a month on your heat bill, who am I to judge? But that's the way I go about it. So if you're in that mid 60s, maybe high 60s, this can be a little bit rough with your spouse. I have dealt with this in the past where my wife likes to keep things hot and warm. She has on her side of the mattress, she keeps it warm. Like I keep mine below neutral. She keeps hers above neutral. So the great thing about it is like both of our sides of the bed are completely different temperatures. So we have been able to compromise with what temperature to put the house on. So sometimes we'll put it on 66, 67. But since I have that mattress topper, it keeps things nice and chill and I sleep very well. But usually it's about 65 and we have settled kind of on that. But I would highly suggest if you don't mess with your thermostat in the evening and you want to sleep better, or you wake up hot, or you struggle to fall asleep, or you don't get any deep sleep, all of those are potential very good signs that you are sleeping in too hot of an environment. Next question. The average SMU operator is 38. Interesting fact. I don't know where you got that, but here we go. Do we greatly overestimate the effects of age in selection? Most people think that anything over like 25 is too old. So yes, we absolutely do overestimate it, or we give it way too much credit. We think that age is a lot bigger of a factor than it actually is. The only downsides of going when you're a little older is your ability to recover from daily activity, like day after day after day, getting after it. Aside from that, you are at an advantage across the board. You're more mature, you have more life experience, you probably have dealt with a lot more things. You've gone through more difficult things in your life than you had at age 22 when you're 35. Additionally, most endurance athletes peak in their 30s, maybe even sometimes late 30s. So I have no idea where you got the stat that the average SMU operator is 38. That may be the case, but it may not be. But either way, I personally went through SMU selection with a 39-year-old and he got selected and crushed it. Most of the guys in my selection class were probably in their late 20s. I was in my late 20s, maybe early 30s, but you absolutely can still perform at a very, very high level. You might be just a little bit more banged up and it might take you a little bit longer to recover from. But just because that's the case doesn't mean it should deter you. You can take steps and develop habits in your life that will help you improve your recovery. You can sleep better. You can eat better. You can go out and party less. You can manage your stress better. You can also train yourself to be able to handle more stress. You can increase your stress capacity, whether that's physical stress, psychological stress, family stress, whatever it may be. So what is super duper stressful for some people might be a walk in the park for other people and vice versa. So stress is very subjective, but and it's also everyone reacts to stress a little bit differently. And everyone's got different recovery abilities from actual training, especially endurance training. There's a lot of genetic factors that go into that, as well as just how consistent you are, how long you've been doing it, and kind of your habits outside the gym, of course. But there is no reason to let age deter you so long as you are within the allowed range, or even if you are outside that and you can get a waiver and they allow you to go to selection and you want to do it, fucking do it. Because a lot of people try to look for cop-outs like, ooh, I would have done this, but I didn't because this. And age is probably the biggest cop-out of all of them. And I would hate to look back on my life and say, you know what? I really wanted to be in special operations, but I decided not to because I was 33 years old, or whatever the fuck age you convince yourself is too old to go to these selections. So I would say, regardless of your age, you can get there if you put the work in, and nothing is too old so long as you are actually allowed to go by the regulations. Next question, knee pain while running. Is it common? Yes. Is there a workaround? I wouldn't say there's a workaround, but there are ways to mitigate it. Usually the best way to mitigate it is to take precautionary steps to not allow it to happen, or if it does start to creep in, make some changes. So if your knees are already bothering you, generally the best way to kind of get around that is to just take some time off from running and do some non-impact stuff for the time being while you maybe rehab your knee a little bit. Depending on how badly it's bothering you, whatever it may be, you might consult some sort of physical therapist or something along those lines. But oftentimes just taking some time off and doing some non-impact cardio for a little bit till it starts feeling better and then reintroducing it very intelligently would be a good way to do it. So yes, knee pain is definitely common. It's probably the most common, maybe knee pain or shin splints are probably the two most common issues from running. And in most cases, the top reason for it is doing too much too soon. Too much could be running too fast. It could be increasing your volume too much. It could be starting with too high a volume. It could be refusing to build a base. If you haven't built a base and you haven't listened to episode 95, I would go and listen to that. That'll teach you pretty much the ins and outs of building your base. But that is always reason number one. A lot of people think it's like running form, which definitely does play a role. If you have shitty running form, you are a lot more susceptible to running induced overuse injuries. And also you're just not going to reach your running potential that you otherwise could, just because form and technique are very important. A lot of people don't think of running as a skill. And if you've ever taken any time off from running in your life, you have lost skill. So it's not like riding a bike. If you take 5 years off, 10 years off from riding a bike, you hop back on a bike, might feel a little awkward at first, but it comes back pretty quick. Running's not the same. If you take time off from running, the reintroduction period, one of the main things you should focus on is actually building solid running mechanics. So making sure you're not overstriding, making sure you're not slamming your heels into the ground. Heel striking is not the end of the world, so long as it's not in a braking manner, like you're reaching out in front and braking and just sending a lot of impact up the kinetic chain. But the overall best way to ensure that you have at least decent running form is to the best way would be to hire a running coach that can actually look at your gait and let you know some things to work on. But B, I would generally focus on cadence. Check out your cadence, whether you have a smartwatch or Strava. I'm not sure if Strava does cadence, but you can look at your cadence and try and increase that over time. There's no perfect cadence for everyone. Everyone says 180. That is wildly off. My cadence happens to be 180 when I run fast, but not because I am like trying to hit 180. That's just naturally where my cadence falls. It's like 173 to 175 when I'm running a little slower, which is common. Usually your cadence is going to be a little lower on easy runs than when you're running at speed, but you can slowly and progressively increase your cadence over time until you get to where you are not feeling these issues. And it might take time. It might take practice. You can do lots of strides. You can do lots of hill work. Hill work generally helps people take shorter steps. It's kind of like training wheels. It's not like you're not going to run on hills forever, but when you're running up a hill, it's a lot more intuitive to shorten your stride and increase your stride frequency, aka cadence. And all those things are great ways to kind of, without a lot of outside help and without a lot of thinking about tons of variables, improve your running form over time. There's a ton of other aspects of running form that are important, and they're very hard to explain just on a podcast, but not doing too much too soon. So go and listen to episode 95. That is the biggest one, and actually treating running like a skill. So sometimes when you go out to run, don't think about your pace. Don't think about your heart rate. Just go and think about your mechanics, how your legs feel, your leg turnover, how it feels every time your foot hits the ground. Is it like a jarring, hard braking force? Or is it a nice grazing force where you're propelling yourself forward rather than up and down and up and down? So those would be some of the main things that I would focus on. And of course, just remember, if you're already banged up, usually just continuing to run through it, hoping for the best, is not a great option. You might have to take some time off. Next question, how challenging is it for Green Berets to get into the SIF? What is your impression? All right, so the SIF is now called the CRIF. I cannot think of what it's, I think it's Crisis Response Force. Basically, every group has one company in one battalion that focuses mostly on DA and hostage rescue and not so much on the other aspects of SELF. And right now, because there's really nothing going on in the world as far as conflicts are concerned, they're not very active. They're not really doing that much. You get to be a very, very good shooter. You get to be very good at CQB when you go to the SIF. but you don't really get to do all the things that Green Berets do. You don't do unconventional warfare, you don't do FID, et cetera, et cetera. So they're very one-dimensional. They're very, very good at what they do. I would liken it to basically Delta Force, except they're the JV team, maybe even the freshman team. So they're going to send to these big, big missions that involve high value targets or hostage rescue, especially. They're going to send CAG or SEAL Team 6 way before they're going to send a SIF team. But at the height of the GWAT, SIF or CRIF guys were definitely getting after it because there was just so many different targets to go hit. CAG and SEAL Team 6 could not cover all of them. So SIF actually got to go do stuff like that. Right now, they're not really doing that. Is it hard to get in? It can be. You usually either have to know somebody or maybe after a few years in group, you go to Sephardic, which is basically the prerequisite course that they force guys who are in the SIF to go to. Basically, you learn how to crush flat range stuff. You learn how to do CQB at a high level. And because SIF does that a lot, they send guys to those schools first so that they're able to better function when they're in that company. But it depends on what group you go to. It depends on who you know, depends on your experience. Usually you don't get sent straight to the SIF unless, of course, like I said, you know somebody. But honestly, most people I've talked to in the SIF, especially recently, they don't really want to be there. They'd rather not be in the SIF. Some guys love it. Some guys are all about it. They love to go shoot. You definitely get to shoot a shit ton more when you're in the SIF than you do in a regular Green Beret company. But you also get to miss out. You have to miss out on a lot of different things. They forward deploy you, and it's just not everybody's cup of tea. So it looks and sounds cool, but just consider some things I just said about when there's no conflict going on, they're not really doing much. Like even the tier 1 units aren't doing a ton right now. They're definitely more active than Green Berets as far as combat is concerned, but it's still not the super awesome place to be that a lot of people think it is from the outside looking in. Next question, do easy, longer runs or fast, short runs disrupt muscle growth more? You can't really look at these two things in a vacuum. Obviously, if we're talking about super short sprints, like 100 yards or less, 100 meters or less, and you're just doing them as like a sprint workout to build sprinting speed rather than endurance, those are going to affect your muscle growth less than really anything because they're a lot more, they involve the same energy system as a lot of like strength training does. You can, especially if you're relatively untrained, you can actually gain muscle from running sprints. I mean, if we're getting really into the weeds, you technically can start gaining muscle if you've never trained before by just going out and running, but that's going to be very, very minimal and very, very short-lived. Eventually, it's going to kind of be the opposite, especially if you're not also strength training. Shorter runs in an endurance sense, so things like 400s, 800s, 1K repeats, things like tempo work, things like threshold intervals, things like that, those are going to be more stressful and they're going to be more of a recovery burden. And therefore, they're going to most likely, if you're comparing one-to-one, that versus a long, easy zone 2 run, those are going to interfere or potentially disrupt muscle a little bit more than an easy, slow zone 2 run. However, generally speaking, so long as you are eating enough food, eating enough protein, not doing way too much training in general, not doing really frequent repeats and tempo work, and you're just not overdoing pretty much everything, I wouldn't worry too much about it. If your main goal is to just get jacked, you're a bodybuilder or something along those lines, I would suggest not running at all. If your main goal is to get absolutely shredded and diced, running is usually not the best option for your cardio. It's just a little more stressful and will interfere with your strength training a little bit more. However, if your goal is to get fast at middle distance, long distance, and also be someone who looks like they lift, be decently strong, then as long as your training is set up in a way that you can recover from it and progress, and you don't just run yourself into the ground, and you're eating enough food. So generally, to really give yourself great insurance for not losing muscle, you want to be in a slight surplus, but you can do this at maintenance as well. If you're in a deficit, the more running you do in a deficit, even if you are lifting, the more you're potentially going to put yourself in a position where you might lose a little bit of muscle. But in general, I wouldn't worry too much about either of these. If you want to get better at running, you have to do both. There's no real option. So if you don't really care about improving your running and you just want to be jacked, but you also enjoy running, then I would stick to mostly slow easy ones. You can overdo that too. If you're running an ultra marathon every weekend, of course, that's not going to be great for muscle maintenance. But in most practical scenarios, if you want to get good at running and you want to continue having muscle on your body, a little bit of both, just being reasonable with it and making sure you can recover and continue progressing both in the gym as well as with your running, you're probably going to be totally fine. All right, we're back. Had to open the window. It was getting hot in here. So it's nice and cool outside. We had the heat cranked up a little, but we're back to being comfortable. So let's continue. On week 2 of your SFAS program, how to battle with shin tightness when rucking faster. So you're only on week 2. I would assume that you weren't rucking a ton before you started that program, which is fine. I mean, generally you're going to do more running before you get into your actual SFAS prep, a little bit of rucking just to, maintain the feel for it, but not a ton of rucking. So what that means is you have gone through the last 2 weeks where you rucked twice throughout both of the weeks. Every week in SFAS prep has 2 rucks, and therefore you're just not used to it yet. Your body has not adapted to the rucking frequency or the pace or the weight or something along those lines. And as you continue to go into week 3, go into week 4, week 5, etc., and so on, all the way up to week 12, you are going to start adapting to it. You're going to start feeling a lot better, and this should not become much more of an issue. You can absolutely do some extra lower leg maintenance. You can do some tib raises, some calf raises. There are some of those in the program, but they are not quite enough. If you're experiencing actual lower body issues, lower leg issues, you can absolutely add to them. You can do body weight ones at your house on a staircase, do some calf raises, maybe single leg, where you really hold that bottom stretch for a while. You can do some body weight tib raises, but make sure you're also doing a little bit of weighted ones, because eventually body weight tib raises and calf raises just become more impractical. You can progress them by adding reps, but you're much better off actually using load. So if you have a tib raise machine, use that. Very rare, but you can get a tib bar, or you can just use kettlebells and do tib raises with kettlebells. And then calf raise machines are pretty common. If you don't have a calf raise machine, you can use a Smith machine, or you can even use a safety bar where you hold on to a squat rack, create a deficit, put a safety bar over your shoulders so it doesn't roll off your back like a barbell would, and do calf raises like that. But honestly, I would say once you get to week 4, once you get to week 5, you're still going to naturally inherently have some lower leg fatigue. That's just the nature of running and rucking, but it should be a little bit less problematic as you get there. If you start to notice that they start becoming like painful, or you start feeling it for longer periods of time after you finish your ruck sessions or your run sessions, then you might want to maybe take a deload week a little bit early, or substitute some non-impact conditioning in on more days than just the one that's already programmed in there. But yeah, you'll adapt to it and it should start to go away. It's just part of the process. Next question, what benefit, if any, does HIIT, high intensity interval training, have for SFAS prep? Does it detract from my other prep? HIIT, as far as all different types of cardio are concerned, HIIT versus tempo versus VO2 versus long, slow distance, etc., HIIT would be the least applicable to SFAS prep. Now, a lot of people have different ideas of what HIIT is. There are like 1,000,001 different definitions of HIIT. True HIIT is when you go for anywhere between 10 to 15 seconds as hard as you can. You can do this. Ideally, you do this on a non-impact thing, unless you're very accustomed to sprinting, but you'll do it with air bike's probably the best. You can do it on a rower. You can do it on a curve runner. That would probably be better than just running flat sprints, unless, again, you are very, very used to that. You can do hill sprints with HIIT for HIIT. You go 10 to 15 seconds all out, and then you rest long enough to be able to repeat that effort. For some people, that might be 50 seconds. For other people, it might be 1 minute and 50 seconds. For other people, it might be 3. It just depends on your fitness levels. But a lot of people mess it up by doing HIIT in a way where they don't rest long enough, and they'll do like 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off. That is not enough rest. Or Tabata, where you do 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off. Those types of training aren't useless, but they're not HIIT. HIIT is basically ATP PC energy system, which takes a while to recover. It's very low endurance, very high power, but it takes a while to recover. So you have to rest a long period of time in between each HIIT round. And all of the benefits that used to be touted about HIIT have kind of been debunked. Like, it's not some magic fat loss thing. And honestly, if you're in a deficit, because HIIT is highly stressful and difficult to recover from, you don't want to do HIIT. I highly recommend against HIIT when you're trying to lose fat. HIIT would be a better thing for like performance, or even if you're just trying to do some cardio, but you don't have a long period of time, but you're also not trying to get like really lean. You're not eating in a super calorie deficit. HIIT for selection prep for performance. The ATP PC energy system, which is the, again, very short duration, very low endurance, high power energy system, is the least important of the 3 energy systems to develop for selection. You really want to have an incredibly robust aerobic system. That is the 3rd energy system. You want to have a well-developed glycolytic energy system. That's the 2nd one, kind of like right in the middle there. A little lower endurance than aerobic, a little higher endurance than ATP PC. But, think of running a 800 meter repeat as fast as you can, or maybe a 600, just depending. That would be the glycolytic energy system. Those two energy systems are a lot more relevant to SFAS prep. Also, because like I said, the HIIT type training, when done properly, is very, very stressful and hard to recover from. It therefore will interfere with your other training that's a lot more important and a lot more pertinent to SFAS prep. So I would take time off and not do any HIIT when you're prepping for SFAS. Honestly, I've never once programmed HIIT for anyone that's within 3 months of SFAS. Just, it's not very fruitful, and it's going to require some extra recovery reserves, and it is going to probably detract from your more important stuff like your longer rucks, your tempo work, your repeat work, etc. A lot of people do consider repeats to be HIIT, and they're not. You're going way too long. That's more glycolytic and aerobic in nature than it is ATP PC, unless you're doing 50 meter repeats or something along those lines, which doesn't really translate over to 2 mile running speed or 5 mile running speed, or certainly not rucking. So highly recommend against it. If you love it, maybe do it every couple weeks, but honestly, it's not really worth your time. Next question, what's the best way to balance calisthenics and lifts for selection prep? There's a lot of ways to go about this, but usually I just have my guys integrate their calisthenics into their lifting days. Most of my clients, when they're within 8 to 12 weeks of selection, depending on the person, I will have them do some calisthenics on both of their weightlifting days, as well as usually on Friday, we do a calisthenics plus strongman day, where you literally just do push-ups, pull-ups, planks, maybe some lower leg maintenance, tib raises and calf raises, and then strongman work. So for example, usually I have my guys do Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Monday and Wednesday are full body lifts. Friday is, again, that calisthenics day. And then on Monday and Wednesday, we'll throw in either some pull-ups or chin-ups or some hand release push-ups on those days. It's really not that difficult. It's not super duper complicated. And you can do them on their own day. Like my SFAS program, the lifting days, I believe, are Tuesday and Friday. And Monday is just a calisthenics plus repeats day. So you can do that way as well. I would definitely consider having one day where you don't do calisthenics like after you're already fatigued from your training session. So whether you do that, if you have a lower body day, you could do calisthenics afterwards, upper body calisthenics. Or if you have an upper body day, you can do some calisthenics in that session. But I would also have another day throughout that week where you do calisthenics when you're more fresh. Just because, if you do a full upper body push-pull workout or something like that, and then you get into your hand release push-ups, yes, there's benefit to doing it fatigued, and you can absolutely do that. But you also want to make sure that sometimes you're hitting those when you're not already super fatigued and super smoked, so you can actually see like a good representation of what you're capable of. So that's what I would do. You can do, if you really struggle with calisthenics, push-ups, pull-ups, you can do more of a greasing the groove method for short periods of time where you do high frequency, like several times a day. Maybe start with like 3 or 4 days a week. You can look up any greasing the groove technique. I've talked about it a million times, and it kind of takes a little while, but that is something I would use sparingly. And it's only something that I would use if you're getting close to where you need to be smashing those numbers. And usually for 6 weeks or so, maybe 8 weeks at the very most, is a good period of time to do that. And be very, very careful with pull-ups, because when you do super high frequency pull-ups and you go too hard, the thing about high frequency, you want to keep things low intensity. Think of them as practice sessions, not like workouts. But a lot of people will do that fine with push-ups. And usually push-ups, even if you do go too hard, are not going to be as problematic on the joints as pull-ups. So if you're doing more reps of pull-ups every time you do, you're greasing the groove, it may be problematic for your shoulders or elbows at some point. So with pull-ups, always tread carefully. A lot of people have really, really not great looking pull-ups. And so make sure your pull-up technique is good. Make sure you're not overdoing it. Make sure you're listening to your body. Make sure you're switching your grip up and doing some pull-up accessories like rack chins and maybe some pull downs every so often to kind of keep those shoulders and elbows feeling good. All right, we'll do 2 more questions. Next question, with 2 sessions a day, how much should I be trying to go into relax mode in between them? Honestly, regardless of how many sessions you do per day, you want to be relaxing when you're not training. as much as possible. Of course, there are certain situations where you're going to be in that like aroused sympathetic state. Sympathetic is one part of your nervous system. Basically, parasympathetic is rest and digest. That's when recovery happens. Sympathetic is when you are fight or flight. You're in a stressed out scenario. So either you're in some sort of acute stressed out scenario, you're getting chased by a stray dog or something along those lines, or you are about to go and lift. You're lifting weights. You want to be sympathetic. You're just going to perform better. And it is a good state to be in when you're lifting. However, when you're not lifting, whether you have a session later that day or not, you want to be more in a rest, relax, digest, chill state, because that's where recovery happens. So whether you're training again later that day, whether you're only not training until tomorrow, you should be trying to relax as best you can in between. And what does that look like? It doesn't mean you have to like lay down on the couch and just be silent and not do anything. But you want to maybe consider some stress management techniques, some meditation, some breath work, some mindfulness, whatever your preferred techniques are. Maybe some easy walks in nature without any distractions, where you're just kind of going outside, moving a little bit, getting exposed to sun, not stressed about anything, not listening to something super riveting, not just freaking scrolling as you walk, just chilling out. So those are all good options. And eating, of course, eating and hydrating. That's probably going to be the two biggest things, especially if you're training for performance-based goals. If you're training twice a day, you really want to make sure you're getting some solid nutrition and solid hydration in between those sessions. But yeah, if you have the opportunity to relax versus the opportunity to go and do a bunch of things that kind of get you all amped up, I would choose option A any day. You're just going to perform and recover and feel better throughout the day. Next question, how would you incorporate extra running and grip/strongman work into JG 2.0? Jack Gazelle 2.0. That's my new program. I would not add anything to it. It's a really high workload program as is. There's some strongman work. I don't think there's any strongman work in phase 1, but there are strongman, I believe, in phase 2. Maybe it's phase 3 that has strongman work. But either way, what you'll have to do is make some substitutions. So if you're trying to get your grip stronger, sometimes if you do like a bunch of high frequency grip training, so maybe you do dead hangs throughout the day at your house on a pull-up bar, or if you have like captains of crush or something along those lines, and you're not trying to do like grip training workouts or grip training exercises where you actually have to go to the gym and like it's more stressful, then you can probably just add that in. You can do some dead hangs once or twice a day from your house. You don't have to go all the way to failure, but just spend a decent amount of time hanging from a pull-up bar. Or if you have captains of crush, you can do that throughout the day as well. You can overdo grip work, but so long as you're relatively reasonable with it and you're recovering well overall, and you are not just fighting through clear signs of poor recovery, then you should be good to go. As far as strongman work, that is when I would kind of consider substitutions. So maybe every other week, instead of the tempo work, you do a strongman session. Or there's Metcons in, I think, phase 1 and 2, and then the strongman is in phase 3. I would have to look at the program, but any phase that doesn't have strongman work, you can replace Metcons with strongman work. So I don't know exactly what your goals are in regards to strongman, but you could do something with sleds. You can do it with more carries. You can do overhead carries. You can do sandbag work. Really just keep things low skill, but you can add those in or sub those in, and you should be good to go. But I would have to know what your goals are exactly and kind of how you're recovering, how things are going for you right now to give you a better answer. But for strongman work, probably sub. For grip work, depending on what you're doing, you might be able to just add that in. Some days you can add some more carries towards the end of your training sessions too. Carries, if you go really heavy with carries and for shorter distances, it's going to be a lot more fatiguing than going lighter and longer. So just consider that when you're going through it. And if you want to build grip endurance, lighter and longer is probably better than heavier and shorter, especially if you're doing it in the context of selection prep or something like that. That's more of a grip endurance with moderate load thing than a super strong grip strength with really, really heavy load thing. You're just going to have to carry moderate loads for a really long period of time. So grip strength endurance is a lot more important than brute grip strength. So that is the way that I would consider doing it. Hopefully you can kind of integrate that as you see fit. And yeah, that's it, guys. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be back soon with another episode. Got some more questions on this same Q&A, so I might do a part 2. But either way, hope everyone has an awesome first week of December, and we'll chat soon. All right, Terminator out.